Hello and welcome to our next module here in our course on Catholic social teaching. In this module we're going to be moving beyond the introduction and looking at basic principles, and we're going to start looking at some actual social institutions. Of course, in this case we're going to be looking at one we maybe often don't think of that way, and that is the family. The family, as the compendium is going to point out to us a number of times, is really the foundational social system or social institution that makes up all these bigger entities in society like businesses and government and the things we typically think about in terms of Catholic social teaching. We're going to be looking at the family. And now some of you who've done some of the other courses, say in natural law ethics, might think that there's a little bit of an overlap here. And there is going to be some overlap, right? Because we have talked about the family before. We've talked about sexual ethics, contraception, homosexual marriage, those sorts of issues. And we'll be touching on some of those as we go through this module. But our focus is going to be a little bit different here. Right? We're not looking primarily at the moral nature of these particular acts. Instead, really what we're going to be looking at is the family as a social institution, and thinking about how that status of the family as kind of the basic unit in society should really be shaping some of our decisions as a society, the kinds of issues that we're going to be talking about in Catholic social teaching as we go through this semester. Now, again, not to beat a dead horse here, we talked last time about how Catholic social teaching is not just sort of a modern political propaganda put into Catholic terms. And the same thing is true here, right? That a lot of discussion goes on, of course, about family issues in our world today. And there might be a temptation or a tendency by some people to think that the discussion of the family and this emphasis on the family is really kind of a modern phenomenon, right? It's really something addressing modern needs and crises and controversies. Because certainly there are, pretty much every day in the news, some new crisis coming up in connection with how we think about the family in the world, and in particular how the Christian understanding relates to the larger cultural understanding of the family. And certainly that is something that gets a lot of attention in Catholic social teaching. But again, this is not some new phenomenon, right? This is something that is really rooted in Scripture and really rooted in Christian tradition. Again, if we go into Scripture, we can see that the family is there sort of literally from the beginning, right? That in the garden, we don't just have the individual. Of course, we have Adam and Eve. We have the first couple who are told, who are commanded to be fruitful and multiply, even though they don't, again, accomplish that in the garden. But shortly after, of course, they do. So the family is there from the beginning, right? This is part of how humans ought to be. And if we look at biblical history moving forward, again, it is centered on the family, right? And we tend to sometimes, I think, lose sight of this, right? We get the names of all these figures, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all this. And we tend to not think about the fact that these people were real families, right? That they had all the same sorts of relationships that we have in our own families. They sat around the common table together. They probably bickered with each other when they didn't get enough sleep. All those sorts of things are going on there in biblical history, right? That this is really a story of God's work with these various families. And of course, in some cases, those families have quite a few problems. But again, the family is kind of always at the center of the biblical story. And of course, we get to the New Testament, we have the family of Mary and Joseph and Jesus. And so we have a family kind of running throughout the biblical story. And of course, in tradition, the family is emphasized a great deal as well. So this isn't just, oh, well, we're getting attacked on all these issues, we need to start talking about the family more. It's really there from the beginning and throughout. So where do we go from there? Well, what I want to do just briefly here then is to walk us through some of the main points raised in the compendium to just talk a little bit about them to make sure it's all clear. And then I also want to raise for discussion some of the issues that this raises in my own mind in looking at this material, right? Because there are a lot of these statements about the family that are going to seem sort of cliched to many of us within the context of the church. But they really, I think, if you look at them, raise some significant issues for us to think about. So that's going to be the plan here. So first I want to start by talking about what the compendium has to say about the unique role of the family as sort of this fundamental institution in society. Now, one of the points that the compendium makes about the family that might seem kind of obvious to us, but I think is worth stopping to think about, because at least I often don't, is the idea that the family is really essential because of the way it shapes people and the way it can shape our perspective on the rest of society. And there's a couple of quotes here that stood out to me in the very first parts of the compendium section on the family. So if we look at section 209, right, it says that the family is the primary place of humanization for the person and society, and the cradle of life and love, right? And that is, the family is where we become kind of truly human, right? And again, if we think about the broader Catholic, the broader Christian understanding of the human person, this should make sense to us, right? Because what is it that makes us in the image of God uniquely as Christians? Is that our God is a Trinity, right? Our God is a God of three persons in perfect relationship with one another, right? And so it is in the context of the family that we image that ourselves, right? It's within the context of the family that we become like God in that way. We become truly human to the extent that being human is being in the image of God. Another quote just a couple sections later that really stands out to me is in 213, where it says, "A society built on a family scale is the best guarantee against drifting off course into individualism or collectivism, because within the family the person is always at the center of attention as an end and never as a means." And again, I think this quote really sort of captures some of the fundamental ideas in Catholic teaching about the nature of the person, and some of the fundamental things that we discussed in the previous module when it comes to the principles of Catholic social teaching, right? And if you'll recall, both sort of as a basic principle of natural law and as a basic principle of Catholic social teaching, right, is this idea of the value of the human person, and the fact that we ought always to treat persons as ends and not means, right? So, well, okay, we've said this before, but how does this tie into our understanding of Catholic social teaching? Right, I think it's very clear there, right, that the family is kind of a crucial buffer against these two big tendencies that you can have in society. Right, one is just a pure individualism, right, that it's sort of every man for himself, or every woman for herself. And there certainly is a tendency for that, I think, in our society and in many societies today, right? And a family really is a check on that sort of attitude, a check on that sort of behavior, right? That there are certain limits on what you can do as part of a family, because you have to come back to that home. You have to come back to that family and interact with people and care for people. And that's going to be sort of an important check on people's tendency to just pursue their own good. The other side of that is this check on collectivism. And I think this is also a particularly interesting point, right? That you can kind of see it in reverse in many situations, or imagine scenarios where you get rid of the family, right? So if you read a lot of science fiction or watch science fiction movies, many of them will have this depiction of a world where children are sort of raised communally, right? Or if you get something like The Matrix, right, where people are grown in pods. You also actually see this somewhat in history, right, with cultures like Sparta, where children are taken from the family at a very young age and sort of raised collectively, right? Well, why do we do that, right? Why do we treat children that way, or why would we hypothetically do that in some future? Well, it's because it breaks some of those bonds and that allows us to do things that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise, right? That why take children from their families in Sparta? Well, doing that is going to change the character of this child, right? It's going to make him more of the warrior that you want him to be, right? Because the family context, the family environment is going to be a check on that. It's going to create a compassion, a tenderness in the person that you are looking to avoid, right? That we want this person to be able to act more like a machine of war, and being raised in a nurturing family isn't going to be helpful in that regard, right? And when we are thinking of sending somebody off to war, or when we're thinking of sending someone into a difficult situation or using someone for a particular task, the fact that that's somebody's child, the fact that that's somebody's spouse or sibling, is going to really complicate that, right? And again, this is something we know obviously, right? There are all kinds of rules and laws against certain kinds of family relationships in working contexts or in a military context or what have you, because we know that those relationships are going to temper our choices, right? That you're not going to make maybe the purely strategic military choice if it's your family members who are out there, or you're not going to make the best profit-based decision if it's your family that's being downsized, right? So now, of course, there are reasons for some of the rules and laws against nepotism and those sorts of things. But the point here is that this is an important feature of the family, right? That it, if nothing else, will force us to treat other people as people and not as just tools or means. A family relationship will do that, right? And so this is another reason why the family is so crucial from the perspective of Catholic social teaching, is that it binds people together in relationships that are going to kind of be a starting point, hopefully, for most people to begin to treat other people the way they ought to be treated. Or for those who haven't really developed much in terms of virtue, this is at least one place where we are going to treat people in that way. And then hopefully that can spill over into some of our other relationships. So those fights we have with our siblings or with our parents, but still within a context of love, where you learn to deal with other people, you learn to develop those characters and virtues. That is going to be a really crucial thing in terms of Catholic social teaching. It's really going to be from that foundation that all of the rest of the things we're going to be talking about in this course are going to be built. So the compendium emphasizes how the family kind of shapes us to treat others as persons. That family relationship is really kind of fundamental to the individual and society. It goes on a little more to talk about how some of the specifics of how families are put together are also essential to both our development as individuals and our understanding of society. And there are a number of things brought up here in the compendium, and some of them are things that we have discussed in some of the ethics courses. But they're worth noting here, right? So gender identity is one thing that is brought up and discussed here in the compendium, right? And basically the idea is that that people are made for this family relationship, for the relationship of marriage and parents and children, right? And so that the gender of men and women is really aimed for that institution. And that just like this family structure, the family relationships are essential to society and essential to shaping us. Along with that is the gender that is part of that, right? And so from a Catholic social teaching perspective, a person's gender is a essential constitutive part of who they are, right? And just like being in family relationships shapes our character in essential ways, being a man or a woman is going to shape us in essential ways, right? And I suppose what we might say in our society today, where obviously this is a really vexed issue, is that yes, indeed, there may in fact be aspects of being a man or being a woman that a person may not care for, right? You may struggle with some of those more than others. You might struggle with that identity a great deal, right? But what Catholic social teaching would say is that, like being part of a family, this is not something that's optional for us, right? My own children get told this in one way or another fairly frequently, right? You don't get to choose who your siblings are. You don't get to choose what family you're born into. That's just the way God has made you, right? And that's part of what you have to learn to deal with. And so from a Catholic social teaching perspective, the same point is being made here in the compendium about gender, right? That gender is just a given, and that then a person has to learn to accept the consequences of that. Right now, this is of course not to say that we accept all the various stereotypes and cultural expectations that have been associated with men or women over the years, right? Many of those are certainly questionable, and some of them are certainly something to be rightly left behind. But at the end of the day, it also says that we do receive this identity, right? And we are called to shape ourselves in accord with it. So that, of course, is going to be a controversial point, but one that really needs to be made in the context of the compendium, right? Because it's really rooted in this understanding of the person as relational, as a person as defined by the family, and a person that is not just soul or intellect or desire, but persons are body and soul together, right? That your body really is you, regardless of your feelings about that, I guess we could say, right? And again, to kind of go back to this idea of kind of the structure that family provides for us, right? One of the interesting things about the compendium, I think for many Americans, is that this is not just the nuclear family we are talking about, right? That we also have reference to a larger family, right? And especially talking about multi-generational families, that we are shaped by our relationship with our grandparents or older relatives, right? And again, this is something that is certainly a big struggle in our society today as we try to deal with how to provide adequate care for people who are living longer and longer, and also many times in situations where families have moved a great deal, right? And we have smaller families, and so there aren't a lot of children nearby, or even any children nearby sometimes, to care for parents and grandparents as they age. But as the compendium points out, right, that this is really not just something that's beneficial for us, right, but that it is also something that we have to accept as part of being part of a family, right? It means having obligations to your children, of course, right, which forces many of us to hopefully develop virtues that we wouldn't develop otherwise, but that also then we ought to and have a responsibility to care for our parents and care for our grandparents. And that can be a real struggle and sacrifice in some cases, but again is something beneficial for us and also beneficial for the larger society. We'll come back to that issue a little bit later. And then just lastly, one of the things I wanted to mention here before moving on to some of the legal and economic things, those sorts of issues, is to just reference what the compendium talks about in terms of childless families, or childless individuals, or those who choose or feel called not to marry, right? And it's important to note that the compendium and Catholic social teaching are not saying that these people are somehow kind of second class or not really truly human. But what it does say is that for those who are not in married life or not in an immediate family in that way, that then the call is to find other ways to develop those virtues, to develop those sorts of sacrificial relationships that many other people find in the family context, right? So for the person who is an individual, kind of at least in terms of how they live day to day, then that person can find opportunities for service that might not be really possible for those who have family obligations. So there certainly are good ways to develop those virtues to become what Catholic teaching would tell us we ought to be outside of a marriage context or family context. But then again, that is going to be something that those who are single or unmarried or childless are going to have to sort of put a special focus on in terms of finding ways to develop those sorts of relationships and those sorts of virtues. Now, as we move from sort of the kind of the fundamental character of marriage and family and get into some of the more kind of specific contemporary issues, I don't necessarily need to or want to kind of repeat all of the things that you can read here in the compendium and that you've discussed in other contexts. But again, I do want to just kind of point out some of the broad themes before kind of moving on to some specific questions I'd like to raise. Right? So when it comes to the family and law, or the family and government and politics, probably nothing here is going to be a big surprise to anyone, but it's certainly worth kind of reviewing what the Church's position on these issues is. Obviously, from the perspective of Catholic social teaching, as we've explained it so far, given the fundamental importance of the family, given the idea of subsidiarity, where the larger institutions ought to be supporting and encouraging and fostering the smaller, more local institutions, we can take from this the idea that society, the nation, the state, these government institutions that define law, ought to be supporting and encouraging the family, right? So obviously this is going to touch on a number of the hot button issues of our day. So that, for example, of course, in the compendium you get a clear statement of opposition to moving to legalize same-sex or homosexual marriage, because this would undermine the sort of unique foundational status of the traditional family as sort of the basic structure that makes up society. So again, probably not a huge surprise there. Also, right, the compendium is going to say that divorce laws ought to be modified, right? That one of the problems in modern life is the ease of divorce, right? And the society ought to be structuring its laws in such a way to encourage families to remain together. And so, for example, things like no-fault divorce laws, while I don't think anyone would say we want divorce lawyers to get rich, there are certainly consequences to making divorce fairly quick, fairly convenient, and fairly cheap, right? That you are, in effect, making the dissolution of the family an easier or more attractive option for people, right? And so again, the compendium isn't going to give sort of specific legal guidelines for how we ought to reform divorce law, but it is going to say that we need to structure society and our laws in ways that are going to support and encourage families, even those families in crisis or in difficulty. And then final note here on terms of legal status is the emphasis in the compendium on the rights of parents, and specifically that the role of the parents in shaping their children's education ought to be respected and supported by society and by the laws. And again, this isn't necessarily something in real crisis at the moment, but this is something that does come up as an issue. And so the Church's position is that the parents do have the sort of fundamental primary right to educate and raise their children as they see fit within the family context. So again, something worth noting and something we might come back to a little later on. And so continuing to speak of things that probably aren't a huge surprise to any of you, when the compendium goes to look at issues of contraception or family size, there aren't going to be huge surprises here, right? That, not surprisingly, the compendium is going to affirm the Church's teaching in opposition to artificial birth control or contraception. But again, here one of the sort of things that I think makes this worth reading, even for those of us who've covered this sort of issue before, is that the compendium looks at this in terms of social teaching, right? In terms of the impact on social institutions, right? And so, again, from Paul VI himself, one of the reasons for opposition to artificial contraception is the effect it has on families, right? And that having multiple families that are significantly smaller, or families that maybe just don't come to exist at all, doesn't just affect the individuals who would have been parents or who would have been parents of additional children, but it also, of course, impacts society, right? And if we're really going to accept this idea that the family is sort of the fundamental unit of society, something that's going to drastically reshape or change or reduce the number of those fundamental units is going to have a ripple effect through the entire society. Sort of one thing that stands out in this regard, just from watching the news, was a recent story about life in kind of modern China, and how peculiar it is in many ways, right? And that you have entire generations of people who are being raised without siblings, and in many cases without any cousins, right? And I remember listening to the radio the other day and hearing a special interest story about a woman in China who was really unusual because she had a cousin. Of course, it's unusual to have a cousin because if you only have single child families, you're not going to have any cousins, right? It's going to be a very odd phenomenon. And that's going to give people, I would say, a warped or distorted view of human nature. It's going to corrupt your society. Now, of course, the United States may not be quite at that point, but the point is that radically changing families through artificial contraception is going to have an impact beyond the morality of, say, an individual act of contraception. Another couple just points I think that are worth noting in this section is a very specific and explicit condemnation of charities that link their charitable work with the promotion of contraception or abortion. And again, this is a big issue amongst others, right? The biggest charitable group, perhaps, or at least one of them in our country, right? The Gates Foundation has been accused of this on many occasions of, yes, they promote good things in terms of disease prevention, but also supporting, or at least historically have supported, access to contraception and abortion services, which is obviously deeply problematic from the perspective of Catholic social teaching and from natural law. Another thing I think, kind of a flip side to that, that's interesting and to point out here in the compendium, is a continuation of a principle from earlier, right? This kind of fundamental role of parents to be able to rear and educate their children. We also get in this section an affirmation of the responsibility and right of married couples to make prudential judgments about the size of their families, right? And so it is in fact noted that even though artificial contraception is condemned, that there can be situations where couples can prudently decide that they ought not to be increasing the size of their family, and therefore can use natural means of limiting fertility to do that, right? And that this is something that is affirmed as a real viable option for Catholic couples, given, of course, that they are being prudent in making these decisions on the basis of good Catholic reasoning and well-formed consciences. But we ought not to condemn those who don't have a really large family, of course, because we often don't know why that might be the case. But even if it is a choice of the couple, that is something that is confirmed as a legitimate possibility here in the compendium, and of course elsewhere in Catholic teaching as well. So the last section here in the compendium's section on the family deals with the family and the economy, or the family and money and economic issues. And there are a number of interesting points made here. And of course I do also want to end up with some of the particular head scratchers that have risen in my own mind after reading all this. But first, let's just cover the basics. So one of the things that the compendium is going to say about the family that's interesting is, right, that we ought not to look at the individual as the basic unit in talking about the economy, right, but instead we need to actually look at the family as the basic unit. And this is going to have maybe some subtle but really still important impacts on the way we think about employees, or the way we think about taxpayers or consumers, right? That if we're looking at the needs and abilities of a family versus the needs and abilities of an individual, that could have a fairly significant impact on the way we think about making economic arrangements. We'll come back to that. But another thing to point to, or sort of the negative side of it, if you will, is to say that economic arrangements that undermine or hurt the family are going to be problematic, and really are going to be, to some extent, immoral, at least if that's the intention, or if that's a foreseeable impact, right? We've talked about this before, again, in terms of pure kind of natural law and ethics, right? We have talked about how if you treat a human person as a means to an end, or as a means to profit, that's immoral, right? And that profit and capitalism can be good things, right? But they are good things to the extent that they are used for the true good of persons, right? That money, jobs, all of these things are good if they're good for people, right? If they're good for the human person, right? Well, the wrinkle that the compendium is adding to that is that we can't just look at the human person in isolation, right? So we need to change those statements to say that profit and capitalism are good if they are good for families, right? But if an economic arrangement, if employment arrangement, if an economy or a market treats families as means to an end, then it is in fact immoral, right? And so that is going to raise some interesting questions for employers, for the government, for corporations marketing their goods, right? All of these different institutions, from a Catholic social teaching perspective, are going to need to consider the impact of their actions on families and not just on individuals. Right now, the compendium goes on to try to flesh this out a bit. It makes a number, I think, of interesting points, right? So one of them is to emphasize the true economy of the household, right? And you get a reference here to the fact that the very term economy originally comes from sort of the household economy, the running of the household in Greek, right? And so in terms of Catholic social teaching, really focusing on and raising the concerns and issues of the marginalized and the oppressed. Well, one of the marginalized groups that gets a voice here in Catholic social teaching are those who work in the home, right? And again, I hope it's safe to say that in today's world, those people who work in the home do have some respect and do have some recognition, and certainly aren't voiceless, say, in sort of political terms. But there is a real tendency, even in our society, to downplay or to denigrate those who choose to be homemakers, or choose to raise their children full-time, or whatever terminology we might want to use for it. President Obama was caught in a major gaffe when he talked about the importance of getting people out of the home and into the workforce, right? As if those people who are home during the day aren't really working, or aren't really contributing to the economy, or to the good of their families, and by extension the nation. But the compendium notes that we need to recognize the value of this work. Right now, One of the issues raised by this, of course, is that I don't think the compendium just means that we ought to have like National Homemaker Day, or go home and give your wife a good hug, or give your stay-at-home husband a good hug, right? That Catholic social teaching would lead us to maybe take some more concrete arrangements, if that might mean factoring in those who work at home somehow in giving certain tax benefits, or maybe even compensating families in some way, or I'm not entirely certain. That would be a issue of prudential judgment to figure out how we could support and encourage those who choose to support their families in those ways. But Catholic social teaching would lead us, according to the compendium, to try to take some concrete steps to support people who contribute to the real economy in that way. Another issue touched on here near the end, right, is for those who work outside of the home, to emphasize that work needs to serve the family, and not vice versa, right? The family doesn't exist to support the employee, right? The employee works in order to support the family. And so, in very concrete terms, right, this is going to come up in terms of a family wage, which is mentioned here in the compendium, right? That employees need to make a living that will allow not just themselves to flourish, to lead a dignified life, but in fact will allow their families to flourish and lead a dignified life. Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that people who have larger families ought to have larger salaries? I'm not sure that's necessarily the conclusion we need to draw, right? So one of the things to note about Catholic social teaching, right, is it's giving us the principles, the prudential judgments about how to make it happen in the nitty-gritty concrete details of the real world. Those things are left primarily to the laity. And in fact, we in some ways do this, right? That there are certain tax breaks for those who have larger families. Now, whether or not that's sufficient to encourage and support families vis-a-vis those who don't have families is maybe an open question. But that would just be one example of how you could deal with this, right? So Catholic social teaching's point is that our society, our economic institutions need to be set up in a way that really support families and provide a family wage. It doesn't necessarily mean that has to happen entirely in adjustments from an employer's paycheck, right? It might be a combination of an employee's pay, but also a way of tax benefits or other social benefits that be provided to families, any combination of things. But at the end of the day, what it would say is that we need to make sure that we provide those who are working a sufficient livelihood to allow themselves and their families to lead dignified lives and to flourish as individuals and as families. Now, this would also, I think, this is also clearly not just about how much you're paid, right? This would also include other policies about working hours and vacations and sick days and all those sorts of things. That families need to be supported by work and not the other way around. And so, again, does this have to happen through government-mandated leave time? Not necessarily, right? If those arrangements could be made on an individual basis or on a local basis, that would certainly be valid and even preferable. On the other hand, if it turns out that in reality employees aren't able to get those benefits without legislation, then the legislation might be necessary. And again, that's an issue we can come to a bit later. But at the end of the day, employment arrangements need to be set up in a way that actually supports families. So not just salary, but also things like time and other policies that allow an employee to really be a active part of their family and not someone who is so consumed with their work that they're unable to do that. And of course, the flip side to that is that while it would be immoral for a company to run itself in a way that takes employees away from their family, it's also immoral for employees to voluntarily do that, right? So those who throw themselves into their work in a way that undermines the family relationships, that's going to be problematic as well. Right, so the employee has an obligation to limit their input at work if it is getting to a point where it is undermining the relationship with their families. So again, that's just a kind of a quick jot through some of the high points that I thought stood out in the compendium's discussion of the family when it comes to its role in shaping the person, its status as kind of the fundamental unit of society, its legal status, its economic status, those sorts of things. So what I want to do now before we wrap up is to just raise with you a couple of other issues that this made me at least think about, and I would like to talk about a little bit with you. All right, so the first of three things I want to sort of raise for your thought and discussion is on this last point, right? This idea of the family wage and kind of checking or controlling employment policies in a way that supports families. Right now, again, as I said, if this happened sort of voluntarily, if individual businesses arrange things with their employees in such a way that they provided a family wage, that would be great, right? But the question is, given that that doesn't seem to be the case in many situations, given that there seem to be many sort of large corporations that don't provide anything that we would consider a family wage, given that there doesn't seem to be any real foreseeable prospect of that happening, what then ought to be a response from the perspective of Catholic social teaching, right? If somebody is putting in a genuine full work day, but they aren't being provided enough money to support a family, and if we're going to pair that with Catholic social teaching's affirmation of the role of homemakers, of people working within the home, how would we argue against the idea of sort of requiring a level of pay for employees that would support a family? Right, so if an individual working person needs to be able to provide for a family, it would seem that in a large number of cases, if not the majority of cases in our society, that doesn't seem to be happening. So how could we go about either changing our society's policies, or how else could we explain this? Is it in fact maybe not the case that we are clearly violating this teaching with the way our economy is set up, right? Or are there other things to consider? So again, that's something that I really kind of wonder about myself. It seems to me that there might be problems trying to live that out, right? I mean, really, are we going to pay people in the same company different amounts of money based on how many kids they have? That seems problematic. On the other hand, it seems problematic if we have somebody, if we as a church are going to say, yes, marriage is good, yes, having children is good, yes, having a spouse who stays home and supports those children is good, but then we're going to turn around and say, well, you know, it's great that you went and had 6 kids and that your spouse is home taking care of them, but this is the amount of money you get, and well, you can't survive on that. Well, that's too bad. So we say those things are good, but look, the reality of it is you can't have so many kids, and your spouse needs to go get a job, right? So it seems to me, at least, I guess the long way to finally come around to this is that many in the church seem to talk out of both sides of their mouth, right? On the one hand, we say those things about lots of children and traditional family structures. On the other hand, we say, well, let's get real. Nobody can really live that way in the real world, and if you can't manage to just get lucky enough or succeed enough to pull that off, and you just kind of have a typical job, well, then you just have to face reality and have fewer kids or have your spouse get a job. How do we resolve that conflict? I think that is a real question that Catholics ought to be thinking about today. All right, the second issue that I would raise, or that gets raised in my mind from going through this material, has to do with that fairly brief mention of sort of multi-generational families and the place of the elderly in our families and in our societies. And this is something that is a real struggle for many families, and certainly for our society as a whole, is how to deal with an aging population. And of course, I think part of the problem here is decreasing family sizes in recent generations, which means there are fewer children and grandchildren to provide the care that might have been provided with more hands, so to speak, in earlier generations. It is also certainly complicated by the mobility of modern American life, where people often don't live near family members that need additional care. But granted those sort of big societal changes, how ought we to provide care for older members of our family, for parents, for grandparents? And if we're going to take the principles of Catholic social teaching, right, which would say that we ought to push things, push efforts, push energy and responsibility to the lowest level possible, as opposed to giving responsibility to larger institutions, does this mean that in the Catholic Church today there ought to be more teaching, more emphasis on caring for elderly family members within the family, right? So again, this is something you can imagine a homily on this would be a pretty uncomfortable sort of homily to deliver. On the flip side, though, at least in kind of the Diocese of Wichita, we do get, I think, fairly frequently some homilies that are a little uncomfortable to deliver when it comes to things like contraception. But I don't recall ever hearing a homily on this, right? And we have to, of course, grant there are going to be situations where an older family member needs care that can't be provided by the family, or there might be other constraints on younger members of the family in terms of their own immediate families, their jobs, whatever, where they can't provide that care. But if we really take Catholic social teaching seriously, it seems like it should follow that there ought to be an encouragement of families to provide care for their older family members, right? And we ought to be advocating for changes in governmental aid, changes in the way our healthcare institutions are set up, that will allow and support families as they provide that care for older members of their family. So again, I would just be interested to hear your thoughts on this. It seems like it ought to be something that we would be regularly encouraged to do, that there would be, support networks in churches, in parishes, in dioceses for families doing this. And there might be some that I'm unaware of, but it certainly doesn't receive anything like the emphasis that some of the other issues connected with families receive in the church today, right? We get a lot of emphasis on supporting single mothers or supporting families with all kinds of struggles, but I don't hear a lot of support for people caring for older family members, but it seems like we should. So anyways, I would be interested to hear your thoughts on that. All right, then the final question that, or at least the big one that came up in my mind after going through this material, is to do with some of the very first things, right? This emphasis on the family as really essential in shaping the person, and that it really is crucial that you be within this family context to develop, right, properly as a person. And I think the compendium brings together a whole host of sources to really make that point forcefully. But the question I think this raises is something that I've often thought about in other courses. It comes up quite a bit for somebody who teaches college-age kids on a regular basis, is how do we square this, I think, emphasis on the family in Catholic teaching with the tendency in modern American life to push marriage later and later and later in life, right? If the family really is so essential in shaping the person, why is it that we as a society seems to encourage people to exist more or less outside of the confines of an immediate family for a significant part of their young lives, right? So for many people, right, the idea is, well, you really should be in, your mid-late 20s before you're getting married, or maybe even 30 in some places. And this varies a bit regionally. People tend, I think, to get married a bit younger here in Kansas than when I was on the East Coast. But still, there does seem to be a push to move marriage later in life. And so we end up with a pretty significant window there in formative young adulthood, right? When people are really deciding how they're going to live as adults when they aren't in the context of a family. And if family is so important in shaping our character, isn't this problematic? Right now, I think this is certainly problematic if we were going to be back in the sexual ethics course, right? That having large numbers of people who are being asked to remain celibate from puberty into their mid-late 20s strikes me as a recipe for disaster. But even leaving that issue aside, right, one of the things that I often discuss with students in my class is the fact that I got married fairly young, after college. My wife got married while we were in college. But I think that was probably a beneficial thing for us, right? That it helped force us to live in ways self-sacrificially for each other that we wouldn't have if we were not married. Right now, again, this isn't to say there ought to be a mandatory marrying age, but if all of these things that Catholic social teaching says are true, ought the church to be encouraging people to get married at a younger age rather than putting it off? Right? Isn't it somewhat contradictory, at least if this is an official teaching from the pulpit, at least what many young people are told within the church of waiting, right? You're too young to get married if you're 19 or 20, that you need to wait until you're older. How does that really fit with all of this emphasis on marriage and the family that we get in Catholic social teaching? Which I think is certainly at least worth talking about, if not worth changing the way we talked to young people today, right? My impression would be that a lot of it has to do with college and career flexibility, right? That if you're married, that's going to make it harder for you to really push to get into the right college and find the right job and all of those things. But again, does that emphasis really square with what we say in other areas and other parts of the compendium, so to speak, when it comes to the real value of family and relationships as being much more important than sort of economic or career success? So anyways, those are at least three kind of big thorny issues that I think come up from this section of the compendium. So I will just leave that there for now. You can probably see where my tendencies lie on those questions, but I would be interested to hear you all's thoughts on a few of those different topics on the discussion board. And of course, if you have issues of your own that you would like to raise, always feel free to do that as well. And I look forward to talking about it with you.